Can the moral darkness of a single night mark the destiny of an entire people for centuries? The story of the Ammonites reveals how moral decisions, even in moments of desperation, can sow seeds of destruction that will flourish across generations. In the arid lands of the ancient Middle East, where the light of divine truth struggled against the shadows of paganism, a people born of sin itself emerged, the Ammonites. To understand their dark origin, we must go back to a fateful night when divine justice and human weakness collided. Imagine the crimson glow on the horizon as Sodom and Gomorrah burn under divine judgment. Among the ashes of these sinful cities, a man escapes with his two daughters. Lot, nephew of Abraham, who had chosen to live among wickedness despite knowing the truth. This first compromise moral decision would lay the groundwork for a greater tragedy. In the darkness of a lonely cave, where fear and despair clouded judgment, Lot's daughters made a decision that defied all divine and natural law. Let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Genesis 19:32. This plan, born out of fear but executed in rebellion against divine principles, would give rise to a nation marked by estrangement from God. From this incestuous union, Ben-Ammi, son of my people, the father of the Ammonites, was born. Unlike Abraham, who chose to follow God and received promises of blessing, the descendants of Ben-Ammi would follow a path of progressive moral estrangement, culminating in practices that would horrify even the surrounding pagan nations. This story confronts us with profound moral questions. Does the end justify the means? Can fear legitimize the violation of divine principles? How do our moral decisions affect future generations? The Ammonites would become a living testimony of how moral compromises, however small they may seem, can trigger devastating consequences over time. In that cave, where moral shadows were denser than physical darkness, a plan was conceived that would challenge the fundamental principles of divine order. Lot's daughters, having escaped the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, carried not only the trauma of divine judgment, but also the seeds of the moral corruption they had witnessed in those sinful cities. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Genesis 19:32. This decision, although born out of desperation, revealed how prolonged exposure to evil can distort moral judgment to the point where the unthinkable seems justifiable. The plan, executed under the cover of night, would mark the destiny of future generations. While Abraham, Lot's uncle, walked in righteousness and received promises of divine blessing, Lot's family chose a path marked by moral compromise. This fundamental divergence would manifest in the nations that emerged from both lines. On the one hand, Abraham's descendants, guided by faith and destined to be a light to the nations. On the other, Ben-Ammi's line, born of deceit and marked by the absence of divine promises. The birth of Ben-Ammi, son of my people, marked the beginning of a nation that would bear the weight of its compromised moral origin. Unlike Isaac, born of faith and promise, Ben-Ammi was born of fear and transgression. This fundamental contrast would shape the Ammonites' relationship with God, their moral direction as a people, and their eventual national destiny. And the younger also bore a son, and called his name Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Genesis 19:38. This verse not only records a birth, but prophesies a legacy of moral estrangement that would characterize the Ammonite nation for generations. What began as a desperate decision in a dark cave would become a pattern of spiritual degradation, leading the Ammonites from knowledge of the true God to the worship of Milcom, from the sanctity of family life to child sacrifices. This story raises profound moral questions for our own time. How do our moral decisions, even those made in moments of crisis, affect future generations? can desperation justify transgressing fundamental moral principles? The legacy of the Ammonites reminds us that the consequences of moral compromise do not end with us, but can extend across generations, shaping the destiny of entire peoples. Over the centuries, the descendants of Ben-Ammi multiplied and grew, transforming from a family born of sin into a powerful nation marked by moral darkness. They settled in the highlands east of the Jordan River, in a territory that reflected the duality of their nature: fertile valleys that promised life and prosperity, surrounded by steep mountains that concealed the horrors of their pagan practices. The territory they came to occupy, in what we now know as Jordan, was not conquered through divine blessing like Israel, but through violence and displacement. The Bible reveals that the Ammonites took these lands from the Rephaites, an ancient and mysterious people. That also was regarded as a land of Rephaites. Rephaites lived there formerly, but the Ammonites call them Zamzummites, Deuteronomy 2:20. This act of violent conquest would establish a pattern of behavior defining their national character. While Israel developed as a nation under the guidance of divine law, the Ammonites built a society reflecting their progressive moral estrangement. Their capital, Rabbah, stood as a testament to their earthly power. Its walls not only protected the city, but also concealed the abominable practices occurring within. Unlike Jerusalem, destined to be a light to the nations, Rabbah became a center of spiritual darkness. Ammonite society developed a structure sharply contrasting with the social order established by Mosaic law. Instead of protecting the weak and defending justice as commanded by God's law, the Ammonites built a society based on oppression and power. Their city-states, ruled by kings who acknowledged no divine authority, became centers of injustice and cruelty. The rise of the Ammonites as a nation reveals an unsettling truth. Material success and political power are not necessarily indicators of divine blessing. Although they prospered and expanded, their growth was stained by practices that violated fundamental principles of humanity. Their history reminds us that a nation can achieve great external accomplishments while experiencing profound internal moral degradation. This transformation from family to nation reveals the multiplying power of sin on a social scale. What began as an act of moral transgression in a solitary cave became a complete system of distorted values, affecting thousands of people for generations. The Ammonites not only inherited a name, but also a predisposition toward moral darkness that manifested in increasingly terrible forms, and the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. Deuteronomy 2:21. This verse, though describing a military victory, also suggests a divine warning. Earthly power, even when it seems invincible, is subject to God's greater purposes. In their rise to power, the Ammonites were unknowingly laying the foundations of their own destruction. At the heart of the Ammonites' moral degeneration lay their religious system, a cult that revealed how far a nation can fall when it abandons divine truth. While Israel worshipped Yahweh, a God of love and justice who forbade human sacrifice, the Ammonites devoted themselves to the worship of Milcom, also known as Molech, a deity whose thirst for blood reflected the darkness that had consumed his people. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. Leviticus 18:21. This divine warning to Israel reveals the horrifying nature of Ammonite worship. The grand temples dedicated to Milcom, with their imposing statues and smoking altars, became the sites of child sacrifices, a practice that represented the ultimate perversion of divine order and parental love. For the Ammonites, these sacrifices were not acts of mere cruelty, but deeply significant rituals rooted in their corrupted worldview. They believed that by offering what was most precious, their own children's lives, they would secure their God's blessing for their crops, military victories, and societal continuity. This terrible irony shows how estrangement from truth can lead to justifying even the most atrocious practices in the name of religion. The worship of Milcom not only violated the first commandment against idolatry, but completely inverted the moral order established by God. While Yahweh demanded justice, mercy, and love for one's neighbor, Milcom demanded cruelty, sacrifice, and the destruction of what was most sacred, family life. This total moral inversion reflects the spiritual principle that when a nation rejects the true God, it does not remain in a moral vacuum, but inevitably falls into increasingly darker forms of worship. Milcom's priests, unlike Israel's Levites, who were meant to teach God's law and promote justice, presided over rituals that destroyed the moral fabric of society. The sounds of drums and chants emanating from their temples were not of true praise and worship, but served to drown out the cries of the innocents sacrificed on their altars. This corrupt religious system had a corrosive effect on the entire Ammonite society. The practice of child sacrifice not only destroyed individual families, but also hardened the collective conscience of the nation, preparing it for greater acts of cruelty and oppression. Like a spiritual gangrene, the worship of Milcom infected every aspect of Ammonite life, from their family relationships to their foreign policy. The contrast between the worship of Yahweh and the cult of Milcom provides an eternal warning about the transformative power of religion, whether for good or evil. When a nation abandons divine truth, there is no limit to the depth of moral depravity it can reach, justifying even the murder of innocents as an act of religious devotion. Tensions between Israel and the Ammonites repeatedly erupted into conflicts that revealed the profound moral contrast between the two peoples. The first interactions began as Israel, guided by God, approached the Promised Land. At that crucial moment, God commanded Israel, "Do not harass the Ammonites or contend with them." Deuteronomy 2:19, showing mercy to Lot's descendants despite their moral degeneration. However, the Ammonites responded to this mercy with hostility and betrayal. Not only did they refuse to help Israel during their exodus, but they also sought to curse them, hiring Balaam to pronounce curses against God's people. This contrast between divine mercy and Ammonite malice would establish the pattern for their future relations. During the era of the judges, the Ammonites revealed themselves as ruthless oppressors, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the Philistines and to the Ammonites, and they oppressed and crushed the people of Israel that year for 18 years, Judges 10:7-8. Their oppression was not merely political, it represented the temporary victory of darkness over light. The most revealing incident of their cruelty occurred during Saul's reign, when Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh Gilead. His terms for surrender exposed the depth of his wickedness. "I will make a covenant with you on this condition, that I gouge out all your right eyes and thus bring disgrace on all Israel." 1 Samuel 11:2. This proposal sought not only military victory, but the deliberate humiliation and mutilation of human beings made in God's image. Saul's response to this threat demonstrated the contrast between divine justice and pagan cruelty. While the Ammonites sought to mutilate and humiliate, Israel's first king acted as an instrument of divine deliverance, uniting the people to defend the oppressed. During David's reign, relations became even more complex. David's attempt to show kindness to the son of the Ammonite king was met with suspicion and hostility. The princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun, their lord, "Do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father?" Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it? 2 Samuel 10:3. This twisted interpretation of an act of kindness led to a devastating war. The lowest point in relations between the two peoples came during Solomon's reign. The wise king, influenced by his foreign wives, including Ammonite women, built altars to Milcom, contaminating Israel's pure worship. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem, 1 Kings 11:7. This moral compromise would have devastating consequences for the kingdom. The conflicts with the Ammonites teach us that war is not merely a clash of armies, but a visible manifestation of the spiritual battle between light and darkness. Each encounter between Israel and Ammon represented more than a territorial dispute. It was a clash between two fundamentally opposed value systems, one based on divine justice and mercy, the other on cruelty and idolatry. The turning point in the Ammonites' history came when their moral transgressions reached a point of no return. The prophet Jeremiah announced divine judgment. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will cause the battle cry to be heard against Rabbah of the Ammonites. It shall become a desolate mound. Jeremiah 49:2. This prophecy was not merely a prediction, but the natural consequence of centuries of moral degradation. Ezekiel delved into the reasons for divine judgment. Because you said, "Aha," over my sanctuary when it was profaned, and over the land of Israel when it was made desolate. Ezekiel 25:3. The Ammonites had not only perpetuated their own abominations, but rejoiced in the fall of those who followed God, revealing the depth of their spiritual corruption. The conquest by Nebuchadnezzar marked the beginning of their physical fall, but their true decline had begun much earlier in the moral realm. Ammonite society, built on foundations of idolatry and cruelty, was crumbling from within. Their sacrifices to Milcom could not save them from divine judgment. On the contrary, these abominable practices accelerated their destruction. And I will make Rabbah a pasture for camels, and Ammon a fold for flocks. Ezekiel 25:5. The transformation of their proud capital into grazing land for animals symbolized the futility of building a civilization on corrupted moral values. The very walls that had concealed their pagan rituals now lay in ruins, exposed to the world. Unlike Israel, which experienced restoration after the Babylonian exile, the Ammonites gradually disappeared as a distinct people. Their national identity, forged in moral transgression, could not withstand the pressures of time and conquest. The absence of a solid moral foundation led to their eventual absorption by other cultures. This progressive decline teaches us that nations, like individuals, cannot prosper indefinitely while violating fundamental moral laws. The story of the Ammonites serves as an eternal warning. Political power, material wealth, and military strength cannot compensate for the moral bankruptcy of a society. The contrast with Israel's survival is revealing. While the Jewish people maintained their identity through centuries of persecution and dispersion due to their adherence to divine law, the Ammonites vanished precisely because their identity was built on the denial of that law. Their decline was not merely the result of external conquest, but the inevitable consequence of their own internal corruption. Until the time of his own land comes, Jeremiah 27:7. This prophetic phrase suggests that every nation has a period of grace, a time to repent and change its moral course. By persisting in their wickedness, the Ammonites sealed their fate, becoming an eternal testament to the consequences of obstinately rejecting divine truth. The story of the Ammonites resonates across the centuries as a warning about the consequences of moral decay. Their disappearance as a nation was not just a historical event, but an eternal lesson about the cost of abandoning fundamental divine principles. The contrast between Israel's and Ammon's destinies presents an unsettling truth. While Israel survived centuries of persecution and dispersion thanks to their adherence to divine law, the Ammonites disappeared precisely because they built their identity on denying that same law. This fundamental divergence in their destinies teaches us that the survival of a civilization is intimately tied to its moral foundation. But afterward, I will restore the fortunes of the Ammonites, declares the Lord. Jeremiah 49:6. This promise of restoration, although seemingly never fulfilled in national terms, reminds us that divine mercy transcends even the gravest transgressions. However, the disappearance of the Ammonites as a distinct people underscores that the consequences of sin can be irreversible in historical terms. For our modern societies, the story of the Ammonites raises uncomfortable but necessary questions. Are we repeating their mistakes? Have we built systems that sacrifice fundamental moral values on the altar of progress and convenience? The Ammonite practice of child sacrifice, though it horrifies us, finds disturbing echoes in our own ways of sacrificing the well-being of future generations for immediate gains. The legacy of the Ammonites warns us that no nation is immune to moral decline. Their transition from a people who knew the true God to practitioners of abominable rituals was not sudden but gradual. Every moral compromise, every step away from the truth, led them deeper into darkness. Today, as we contemplate the ruins of Rabbah, buried beneath modern Ammon, we must ask ourselves, what values are we passing on to future generations? Are we building societies based on eternal principles or on the shifting sands of moral relativism? The story of the Ammonites remains an eternal testament that divine judgment on moral wickedness is inevitable, even if it takes generations to manifest. Their disappearance reminds us that no material success, no political power can compensate for the moral bankruptcy of a society.